Well, this weekend marks 75 years since Japan's surrender in the Second World War. Once the fighting ended, the US occupied Japan, imposing a constitutional democracy on the former empire. One veteran, John Hutchins, who's 96, was part of the Chindit Special Forces, which fought behind enemy lines in Burma, facing disease and monsoon rains. He's been speaking to our correspondent Robert Hall.
Twice a day for 5 weeks they attacked. Morning and evening. Our losses were very heavy.
Here they are in close-up for the first time in newsreels. The Chindits.
They took their badge from the lion statues which guarded Burmese temples. The ragged contingents from Britain and the Commonwealth, outnumbered by the Japanese, unrecognisable through hunger and illness. John Hutchins had volunteered for the Chindits. Fighting through the monsoons in 1944, he came close to death.
When I went in, I was 11 stone. I was now 8 stone 4, a skeleton. I had no energy, I had no fight, I had no spark. So the rule was, before we went in, if you're killed, you're dead, because your purpose in there is to kill or be killed. If you were walking wounded, you carried on. If none of those things were possible, and it impeded the advance of those 80 men, you were left. I was left with 4 days' rations and ammunition. I lay in a chong with water in it and I couldn't move. And I found I had a spark. I wasn't dead. I wasn't immobile. And I got up, and for 4 days and 4 nights I marched alone. Until I reached our men.
The lions of the Chindit army are remembered here on the banks of the Thames, a modest monument to outstanding bravery and resilience.
Well, I love talking about it because it's a whole part of me, but I shall never ever forget any one of those men. And I'm delighted to have had the honour of being called a Chindit.
Moving story there from John Hutchins. Well, how did Japan go from being an enemy to a friend of Western countries? I put that question to historian Paul Letters.
The relations between Japan, the good relations between Japan and the West today, were forged in those first few years after World War II. So in that first 7 years or so, that really shaped much of the international relations today. The US, of course, occupied Japan from 1945 until 1952 under General MacArthur. And they, in effect, imposed a pro-American, pro-Western style of government and political system on Japan. At first, the emphasis was on disarming Japan so that it could not obviously be hostile again. But soon as the Cold War, of course, came to fever pitch in the late 1940s and then in 1950 with the Korean War, the emphasis from the American point of view was much more to have Japan, to place Japan in a good position to be a strategic ally through the Cold War. And so they go on.
No, please, I was just going to say what's interesting is how you can go from being an enemy to becoming a key ally. When we look at what's going on in so many countries in the world today, what lessons can be learnt?
Yeah, you could say this was the US's sort of first attempt at nation building abroad, and relatively successful. It was interesting. MacArthur had choices he could make. Even within the US side, there were those who wanted to maintain many traditional elements of the Japanese political system, but he ignored those voices, used American advisors who generally actually had less experience with Japan, but were more in favor of a full liberal democracy with full human rights being set up there. On the Japanese side, it might be surprising to hear, but there were actually many within the political and intellectual elite who just looked at the matter in a very pragmatic way. The traditional Meiji Constitution of Japan had ended in abject failure with defeat in World War II. They looked at America, they saw the wealth and power, they saw success. So they wanted that model.
Interesting.
And so, go on.
And we now call it Victory over Japan Day. Now that Japan's an ally, is that term quite helpful in our current conversation?
Probably not, to be honest. I mean, I think obviously there are still veterans from the war alive today, and we should remember their sacrifices and the hardships and so on. But as well as doing that, I think we can focus on the peaceful and prosperous and positive nation that Japan has become ever since 1945. Obviously not involved in any wars, whereas if we look at the UK or the US, they've been involved in many.